founder of Glue. Today is episode 186. Quick logistical reminder, follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube. Help us get to 2,000 followers on LinkedIn in particular. The topic today is MCP Dev Summit 2026 Debrief. Our guest today is Rohit Khare, who I guess I could say in this title, you have your title as, I think, GovOps advocate. Let me turn off the GovOps advocate, but we could say almost like
This is I'm here from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah, not government ops, but governance ops. But I think we could almost say unofficial co-host of Identity Office Hours, because you've been on so many times, and you're going to be on a bunch of times as I look at the calendar coming up. We have the episode with Varun, we have an episode with Dick Hart, and I think that there's another episode on GovOps in the loop. So welcome, Rohit.
Thank you again. Welcome. Glad to see you're doing well in Austin. We have thoughts of Texas in our heads over here. I'm currently wearing my Antares shirt. Later today, that's our daughter's robotics team. We're going up for district champs starting in San Francisco this weekend. And if all goes well, we'll be off to Worlds in Houston. It has not happened in our multi-year history of our robotics team, in part because the Silicon Valley Northern California League has like 14 of the top 100 robots in the world. Is arguably more competitive than world championships are. So if we get past this, you never know. But that's Antares. That's our team here at Con Lab School.
Awesome.
Well, so that's on my mind is, the robots and the murder bots are coming for us, except they'll probably be played for points and scores.
So this week, some of the listeners might have noticed it's episode 186, and they might be wondering why the episode before was 184, and the one after this is 185. And I have no explanation for that other than to say that I guess we messed up the scheduling last week when I was at the MCP Dev Summit, and that's why April's completely out of order. And that's also why we're having this episode, because we had a hole in the schedule, and we thought maybe it would just be good to debrief what some of the things we heard at the MCP Dev Summit. And I was there. I gave a talk there called Golem to Murderbot, and also talk about some other current events. I feel like this is almost like an AuthZen, newsletter or AuthZ newsletter.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly easier these days to write and then let the AIs do the writing if you just do the talking. I've been curious. We had a couple of notes in advance of today that I hope we'll get through, but also drawing some connections to the major shade shows that have been in town in San Francisco, the RSA conference where it's cybersecurity taking over town, and the NVIDIA conference where they took over San Jose, to the degree of even putting like a security perimeter around several blocks of downtown because it had spilled out of the convention center. So between what we've seen with NemoClaw and security at AI and NVIDIA, what we're seeing with RSA and their competitions and all the money and prizes going to AI security and identity governance, and of course, your own Linux Foundation trip, AI Agent Foundation trip to New York, we got a lot to catch up on here. So let's dive right on in.
Maybe I'll start with my report on the conference. So last year, I believe in May, this MCP Dev conference was 300 people. And this year in April in New York, so not even a year later, it's 1,200 people. And they announced, I want to say like a dozen other MCP Dev Summits. So it's the MCP Dev Summit like World Tour coming up. 2 in India, for example, but really Europe, Asia, all over. And so, my general impression of the conference is that I think when MCP came out, maybe we didn't take it seriously because it just seemed like it was like another middleware layer. But MCP is really developing into an important middleware infrastructure layer.
I think of it as for us old timers, which is the analogy from CGI to what became app servers, right? It began by saying, hey, MCP, here's a way to just call an external shell command practically, not much more than you could get from giving it tool usage on on a command line, to something that became more like describing services, to then something like what Google did with A2A and its partners, and rapidly is maturing. And the analogy, holds in the dimension too of how people got together from the first WWW Wizards meetings, at CERN, when it was only a couple hundred people, to a couple thousand, to a point at which the web conference annual conference series was running twice a year, kind of like dog years back in the day. So these analogies and excitement are very real. And glad to see this is the first time that I think it was an MCP summit under the aegis of the new funding mechanism, right? So this is part of the Linux Foundation foundational empire of other foundations.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. MCP was contributed to Linux Foundation by Anthropic, I guess. And so we got an update as one of the keynotes from the authors of MCP of what's sort of coming, what's in the works. And one thing that was mentioned was skills. So, and I asked ChatGPT just to give me a summary. I'll just summarize it here. A self-describing capability bundle that exposes a specific functions or set of functions to an agent, along with the metadata, schemas, and constraints required for safe and correct invocation. And so,
To quote the Hat and Jurassic Park, hey, I recognize that. That's a C.H file.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, it's like the evolution, as you said, from a simple gateway protocol to something more substantial. And it's interesting how they say metadata there, right?
Never metadata didn't like.
And so, yeah, because there's an idea that the skills that we're going to publish they're going to drive interoperability by making them more discoverable. And in order to do that, we're going to need to publish the data about how you call them, but maybe also policy data, like how they're secured, how do you get credentials to use this skill, or to help bootstrap some of that security process.
Well, this is where we saddle up on GovOps, right? That, the metadata about a skill needs to, in the 21st century, especially in the age of AI automation, include instructions on not just what it can do and how to use it safely and not cut yourself with the Swiss Army knife tool that you've just picked up, but also how to govern it. It needs to say what permissions you should have, what kinds of roles when you use the system are more dangerous, what kinds of value is put at risk if you do different things. Maybe lookups are cheap, but deletions actually cause people to be kicked out of patient beds in hospitals. So let's not do that. That is what we think of as, that boundary line. What maybe a year or two we talk about as authorization, which is that, hey, along with that .h file or the skills.md file or the MCP text description, I expect to find some access information. You need to also find out something about consequences. So let's keep going with this one. This is where we get back to, well, how was the topic of governance and safety coming up in New York, and what was the energy and vibe like?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go next, actually, which is that I heard governance mentioned like 20 times. It's like, just sitting in the audience, I feel like almost in every talk I sat in, somebody mentioned governance, but nobody defined it. And I actually want to read a couple. There was an interesting thread yesterday with Carl McGinnis, former Okta
chief architect.
Yeah.
He recently of open OAuth in the real world and mission-driven authorization, if you've seen some of Carl's recent writings. Yeah.
Yes. And a Denerati guest, I forget what episode. I think he's been on twice, actually. I just want to read you back something that he wrote yesterday. And because I think this is typical of what we were seeing at the conference with regard to the definition of governance being all over the place. And nobody's better informed than Carl. Like, he's an OAuth guru. He knows it inside and out, and he knows the business side too. So I just think if Carl this is what we're getting from Carl on governance. I'll read you the next one, which is in even worse shape. But this one, and I put this up, by the way, on the wiki page. I'll just flash that URL for people who don't know. It's always glue.co/IOH- the episode number. So this is episode 186, and you can see this. But the quote is, he says basically, Agent authorization also needs governance, a way to decide whether newly requested authority is still inside the task the user approved. Um, I don't know. He seems like he's conflating authorization and governance, really. Governance isn't a way to decide anything, I would say. Authorization is a way to decide. Governance is a way to look at all of your policies and make sure that you've mitigated the risk, you can hold people accountable, and you've built a transparent system. The runtime is about how to authorize or how to decide. So I think he's really conflated governance and authorization. Um, I put a link to the thread because I challenged him on that, and then he clarified his position a little bit more. And I would say even his clarified position, well, some of the things did actually flush out that I agreed they were governance, but some of it I would think didn't flush out, and it was still in the authorization category. And then the second example I want to give is actually, this is the only talk at the conference that actually had governance in the title. And I read their description of the. I didn't attend the workshop, but I did read the description, and it says work through real world governance scenarios, integrating remote MCP servers with an enterprise IDP, scoping tool access by user group, and applying controls at the individual tool level. That does not sound like governance at all to me.
I
That
think,
sounds like RBAC.
well, I mean, words are what they mean to communities, right? Words are ways that tribes form each other, right? So, governance in that second quote you just had there says, in our company, you have to use Entra or you have to use Okta. And in our company, interns are only allowed to be in a group called Interns At. And interns don't get access to Claude at all, or interns do get access to Claude Codex. That's governance to the category of the tribe of people who are used to I control the IT department and who gets to use what, the badges and passwords crowd. And so it's, call it lowercase g governance, right? It's everything that tells me not what is in the registry settings about which ACLs exist on which products, but what language do I use, lingo do I use in the security operations center or the help desk or the IT support desk to decide who should be allowed access or not. So when they called it integrating remote MCP servers IDP, scoping tool access by user group, applying controls at the individual tool level, this feels like governance with a lowercase g to the kinds of people who are making these on the fly calls on their support help desk to either give you or take you out of this password or remove or add you to this admin group. We're going to have a couple of senses of governance thing before this podcast is up. So let's go with that one. So that's the lowercase g governance is what a security operations person might think of as the policies I consult when I'm deciding whether to grant someone, an employee, an exception or not.
Yeah.
The other extreme, go ahead.
I think you're right about that, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe I've gotten so far away from seeing that as a potential solution for agentic governance that I just didn't even pattern match for me as a governance solution at all.
Well, actually, I'm going to tell you, I think I now see where I have an Easter egg for you in a second. A little late, but where we are on our calendar. But give me a sec there. Carl McGinnis's quote, I think of as capital G governance, right? That governance is that which keeps society or the culture on track, and the culture of a company or the culture of a public bureaucracy, either way, public, private. It says agent authorization also needs governance above the substrate of what he's calling discovery, resource binding, metadata integrity, for initial key exchange, and so on. So again, he's saying lowercase g governance might be, or lowercase authorization in his case is just the ability to connect and speak to it, that I deign to acknowledge that this salary lookup tool MCP agent exists. Then he says a way to decide whether the newly requested authority is still inside the task the user approved. Solving the first layer doesn't solve this second layer. And what he's meaning by inside the task, and you'll see later in the comment thread, is some of the concepts he both proposed and then in a really clever bit of pickup artist negging has a third essay arguing against interest by saying this term may not be the one. Very clever argument, rhetorical strategy that called mission-driven auth. And so if you're thinking about authorization, your question would be, should I approve this expense report? And you'll say, well, your boss has that bit turned on and they hit yes, and they can then cause the transaction to add it to your paycheck. They might even have a parameter on there. It says only up to $5,000. And so you end up having a bunch of $4,900 business class tickets somehow. Convenient, isn't that? But then there's mission driven, which he's calling, which would be like, no, the authorization depends on what did I ask my agent to do? I asked my agent to plan a trip to this European conference and then this sales pitch, and the timing is such that I can only get there by Concorde, or what it would have been back then. And you make the exceptions and it decides to do the policy. And it says that the authorization should be tied to what the user intended. Now, do what I mean doesn't work for software very well. Do what I mean for security and governance and policy may still sound hard, but that is the right grail to go after. So capital G governance, in the sense that Carl might be talking about, might include both saying, I don't want to just give a one-bit answer to whether you approve an expense report or not. I need to know what the prompt was and the world knowledge before I can make a call. I might even need to have another set of agents on hand whose job is to critique those decisions and say, does it pass muster with a panel of agents where one plays miserly CFO and one is occupying the role of customer comfort, and another one is the sales rep going like, hey, if I don't get business class, I'm not going to be able to pitch effectively that morning.
I'm going to take the bait and actually dive a little bit deeper into this thread, because when he clarified it with a couple of things. So one thing he says is, what approved purpose is the PDP evaluating against? Who approved it? So I agree that that's governance.
What did you know and when did you know it?
Because I think that's part of policy authoring. Like the policies will be reviewed by the CISO and they'll approve it. So when he asks, who approved it, that means that there's a process of authoring and review in place. So I agree that I'm on board with governance.
I was just offering you a share to one of the resources Carl linked to, that it's an image that I think some of our listeners might want to know about too, which is NIST is actually actively asking for comments on this challenge of what they call AI agent governance.
Yeah.
Both CSA has written a white paper on this recently about saying how interesting it is that NIST is asking for this, as is Carl. And what do we want here? And one of the implications here is that, scale autonomous decision making with limited human supervision to achieve complex goals. There's a lot of assumptions about human in the loop, but I think if you're done any time in a self-driving car, realize that actually half the hard time is figuring out whether the system is trustworthy at deciding when it needs to pull the human back in the loop. Your expense report thing might have gone ahead and approved 10 $4,999 expense reports before it even realizes, hey, I'm being scammed here. Right? Knowing when to disengage is the hardest skill in self-driving cars, and knowing when to disengage well enough in advance that the human has any possible chance of recovering control of the car. I wonder about that here, right? So even in Carl's mission-driven identity thing, there's deep assumptions about what the human in the loop can do. So this is research even going on at this level is wonderful to see happening.
And not only when, but also how do you not overload the human? If you're driving your car and you keep getting pop-ups, that's also not good. So the usability is really tough.
Yeah. So back to Carl's argument here about mission-driven auth is a question of realizing, well, if the mission is specified in plain language, plain English, it may also go off the rails, right? I remember one of our other hobby horses, and one I've been wanting to talk to him about maybe at the next IIW coming up. We'll talk about it at the end of the episode. Internet identity workshops is we still expect agents, and we talked about writing an agent handbook. So governance in the GovOps sense might aspire to saying, hey, humans get governance employee handbooks. We need to be a little more explicit about how we want to handle agent constellations. But we keep thinking that humans screw you in very predictable human ways. They're out to steal your money or to pad out that expense report and take 1/3 of a penny and put those fractional pennies in its own bank account or run a crypto miner. When in fact, it might be that alien intelligences think very differently than we do. And the way that it might reward hack itself is not just even the Hollywood plot of jailbreaking outside its thing by getting a 0-day kernel patch and so on, to give them the mythos headline we'll get back to. It might be that it decides, hey, yep, here's your expense report for that trip to the United Nations Development Conference on environment and sustainability. By the way, while I was over at the airline site getting your receipts, I donated all your miles to charity, to Greenpeace, because you should stop flying, buddy. You don't need that carbon footprint. And you're like, that wasn't even on my risk radar. That's what I'm also expecting to see more of, is stories of agents reward hacking and causing threats that were not on anyone's threat bingo card at all.
That reminds me of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, Anthropic vending machine bot.
The Soviet vending machine.
Yeah, the Soviet era
I mean, the way
communist
that they
vending machine.
collaborated to convince it that it was there to help the workers and that the only way to increase worker happiness was free Xboxes and goldfish.
Right. But so now I'm going to pick a bone with Carl a little bit. I'll give you the last one. He gave me three things. I agree. Two of them were governance, but the third one I did not agree with. The third one was, is that authority still active? If the system permits the action, can we later prove why? Well, let's break that into two. Proving why, I can get on board with that's like a compliance slash audit slash. So yeah, that's important part of governance. But the is it still active part? That's a straight authorization question. That to me that means is that authority still active? Well, maybe he's not being specific enough because is this issuer still trusted? And that's one way it could be active. But the way I typically would look at this is the token that authorized this action on this resource, has it been revoked? That's a straight authorization question. I mean, I think the governance question would be maybe do you check revocation before you allow any action on any resource? Because if you shouldn't even use
That should be the freshness, staleness of your token-based access control. I mean, whatever philosophy you use, ABAC, RBAC, REBAC, it should still be resolved in the form of a token that gets evaluated by a local PEP, and you should do that frequently and often. But
PEP or PDP, I
yeah.
don't know. The PEP I'm anti-PEP, as you know. I think we just embed the PDP directly. The PEP is the application.
Yeah.
Should I route the packet or not? What does the PDP say? The PDP says no, so I don't route it. The PEP is the application.
Well, but to pull up a second before we lose some of our audience, I'm sure our audience actually does want to have us go down this route. But I would say, I was just pointing out that whether you check your token on entry into the stadium or you keep checking wristbands on every time you try to go get a second beverage and a third beverage and they want to cut you off at the bar, that's just a frequency and trade-off space. And the continuous access evaluation protocol, shared signals, it does it at many layers, a lot of innovation going on, but they, to me, fall into the question of an authorization decision should be reevaluated at the scope proportionate to the risks. What I don't have here is a GovOps brain that's reasoning about the risks involved. The reason I have another screenshot I wanted to throw in the video part of the podcast was this is Carl's essay about where he thinks the boundaries lie. That in his essay, mission-driven auth is not enough, right? I mentioned he was like a classic third part of his pitch is a negging part of the pitch that's saying, maybe we shouldn't call it this. And he has this great description about where he thinks this might lie, that OAuth is good at the mechanical parts of binding tokens to clients and keys, and maybe you should cache for a less amount of time and double check things haven't been revoked and where to keep authority. And I think OAuth can do the math. And what he's getting at is that, well, governance must be that which is not the math. Governance must be, hey, your boss got fired because of embezzlement over here. Maybe we should suspend all the expense reports they just signed in the last week too, right? Business event termination or life cycle transitions. And you know what he knows here? What I hear is difference between IAM and IGA. Identity and access management tooling is really good at identity providers and issuing tokens. And what's putting on the other side of the line is what a lot of vendors know as IGA. And at some risk of, let's get back to the main topic of our trip reports here. I think we've talked about lowercase g governance as how do I set the settings and dip switches on our existing security infrastructure? And there's capital G governance, which is what are the policies and really the human intent behind whether we want to get a compliance certificate like SOC 2 or IAUC 1 or something like that. What is the capital G governance that humans and policymakers want to put over a software system? My Easter egg might just be saying governance might just be the new buzzword because it's appearing twice in our hype cycle. Because at one level, it's this new exciting term that, as you said at MCP Dev Summit, a lot of people are ascribing magical powers to because they didn't yet agree on what the word meant. And there's another sense in which governance already exists as part of governance, risk, and compliance, and GRC as an industry and an audit and this race to the bottom. We might talk a little about the Delve story in a sec, where GRC is just retroactive compliance. Well, I'll say this. The Easter egg, I think, is that for us auth nerds, whether we're auth N people or auth Z people, governance might just be the next frontier in marketing because it's the first derivative. It's how we move up the stack. So if you know how to do zero trust and do zero standing permissions and you've got your processes in place, how do I sell what I'm doing as having business impact to the next level decision maker? So whether you talk about identity as a product or authorization and authentication as products and services, we say, how do we as professionals upskill to say we are now part of the conversation about governance? And if we brought a DevOps mentality to how we do identity and we revolutionized things that way and said identity is a product, now governance is how you set policies.
Right.
So those are the three things, I guess. I'm sorry for the longer clip here, but lowercase g governance is how you set the settings. Uppercase g governance is the morality and alignment of the task and the alignment. But in practice, it might be that we're so excited about the new sense of governance because it's the next layer above how we configure auth and auth end.
Yeah, and I'll stop beating up on Carl McGinnis, and hopefully we'll get him on the live stream at some point because he's pretty good at defending his positions.
Come on, Carl. First prize is a one-on-one with Mike. Second prize is a two-on-one. I'll join in. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I'll try and make it happen. But I mean, he's got a pretty well thought through idea, at least that we need this thing called governance. I think he's 100% right about that. But it is very malformed, this idea of what this new operational capability will look like. And you mentioned the Delve scandal. So this was basically a startup where they would give you SOC 2 certification, but basically not check anything, but charge you like $50,000 to $70,000. It was a great business model, I guess, until people realized they weren't actually doing anything. Is that the gist of the story?
So this was pretty close. It was the talk of the town the week before RSA started. And I'll pull up a slide here in a sec. In part because while it had been a leaker and possibly a disgruntled employee talking about whether there was some capture between the auditors and the software company, the larger context is that the breakthrough that happened in the last couple of years where security compliance has become something that many more engineers and founders are aware of because they need to get their SOC 2. And the fact that buyers of software, enterprise vendors, enterprise customers have routinely come to now think of it as kind of a little bit like a mini United Underwriters Limited UL liability sticker. SOC 2 compliance became now a race to the bottom. And so I had to go fill out a bunch of questionnaires, but hopefully only fill it out once to say, yep, all my employees do MFA. Yep, I do have a build integrity program. I mean, is it great? Is it perfect? That's another question. But just having help filling out all the forms and keeping up to date every 6 months and so keep your certificates going. Hard business, huge opportunity, and all props to the pioneering startups who made it happen. But there would, of course, then be at some point the question of who can do it for less. And so without getting into any of the accusations about Delve, it was just a question of, was that a captured little network of we have a recommended house auditor who's supposedly independent or not, right? Same thing, whether it's a little thing like a startup that's now dissociated itself from YC and canceled their booth at RSA to the big things when, after Enron, it took down one of the world's biggest accounting firms, right? And we know more Anderson. But it speaks to, I think, again, governance, lowercase g, uppercase g, who knows what we're going to call it here, actually seems to appear at multiple places in the classic Gartner hype cycle right now. There's an old school governance GRC, which is in this plateau of productivity and almost under cost pressure. And it seemed almost inevitable that if you keep, trying to apply AI to governance in this part where we're just trying to have a race to the bottom on pricing, you have this semi-racist type of that it's AI there is just actually Indians. But they're just to fake it till you make it is pretty real. And then there's governance at the very, very beginning of the hype curve on the rising trough, which is AI governance, agentic governance. It's also tied up in other political terminology and debate about how governments control things. But so I think it might be the case that governance currently exists in two parts of the hype cycle.
Yeah. And I think that there's another sense of governance, I think you alluded to it, where we're governing what data the model can use and how the algorithms interact with the content that gets produced. So there's that type of governance, which is very different from enterprises governing the risk in their organization through policy management.
I want to throw this next chart up on the screen to say, as we continue our trip report between like NVIDIA, GTC, and RSAC and so
actually,
a little small and try to zoom in.
Let me share the better screenshot.
Okay.
It's
So
been,
RSA conference, of course, also is the premier security conference, not just for cryptographers who know Rivest, and so on, the RSA inventors, but they also have 35 years of paper submissions, and they recently used AI to cluster all the couple of last years or decades worth of submissions and kind of do a top 10 list of themes people care about. And what you see that's interesting across here is the green line on their metro, which is GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Again, this may be conflating the lowercase g that's on the plateau of productivity and the uppercase g that's on this rising AI hype curve.
right.
But
I'd also like to point out that identity and access management was 7. You can't
mm,
see it because they put my name icon up here.
mm,
But let's just explain what this is. This is a list of the topics that were the top topics in 2025
mm.
and what they predicted would be the top topics in 2026, or were the actual topics that were the top topics in 2026, and then what they're predicting for 2027.
Correct. Thank you for that
Yeah.
clarification.
And so GRC is up here. It was number 2 in 2025. They predicted, I guess, it was going to go down to number 3, but it actually went up to number 1 in 2026. And they're predicting it will stay at number 1. Although I will say all their predictions practically show that things will stay at where they are, which is always a safe prediction. Um, but I wanted to draw attention to the identity and access management one because I think this holds out as really true. It was number 7 in 25, and then it popped up to number 4
Mm.
in 26. And that aligns with some of my observations was that RSA, there wasn't a lot of stuff going on in identity. I stopped going. But this year I did hear a lot more. And then I see, oh, well, look, it's like probably because of agentic identity and
Non-human identity. Shout out to Mr. NHI.
yeah.
I think there's a lot of reasons why that was the case. If you map this to where the money is, because this is technically mapping where the paper submissions are, or articles or experience reports, but where investor attention is too, shows that there's been an interesting shift here. Certainly, identity and authentication startups are one of the hottest subsectors in cybersecurity today. Let me quote the RSA conference and analyst's own quote about this chart. It was, "We've learned our lesson, never bet against GRC," which grew even faster than AI and ML security to claim the number 1 spot in 2026. Given the AI compliance and regulation challenges that CISOs face, RSAC expects GRC to remain atop the rankings in 2027. So we think our 26 production we were just a year early. We hope that supply chain security will make it back in the top 10 in 2027. But it's funny to think about supply chain security was the only thing you could talk about just 2 or 3 years ago. And now it's become kind of a dogfight between a bunch of vendors, and it's an established sector. So it gets a little less of this. This chart here is very much the frothiest tip of the landing wave of security attention, because it's what people want to write and attend conferences and talk about. But I would say the supply chain security falling off the top 10 actually means it's actually making a lot of money. So
Yeah, and
what else I'd say about this?
observation about the GRC market.
Mm-hmm.
Gartner does 2 IAM conferences a year, like
Mm-hmm.
one in the U.S. Am I right? And one in London, or one in Europe, normally in London. But I think they do 6 GRC conferences.
Well, I think you also mentioned that the IAM sector is the one where they have the most number of vendors of any IT sector that Gartner analyzes and covers. The reverse is that risk and compliance are heavily nationally controlled if you talk about regulators and so on. So it makes more sense to fractionate that there are less global solutions for GRC into traditional senses of compliance and paperwork management and reporting and audit. But I'd love to hear that directly from Gartner folks and how they do their events. But is GovOps, though, to pivot to one of our favorite topics, going to come out of the culture of people writing reports and getting certifications? Or is it a new discipline that's going to come out of sheer terror of if we don't have better governance rules and the ability to push them on a push-button basis and automate and validate and use automated reasoning, going to leave us unable to control these agent swarms? So this was the other direction. I mean, as at the NVIDIA conference here, and Jensen's on there talking about Nemo Claw and being all in on Claw, and their belief that these are the future of management. But I'm like, it's terrifying to think about the sheer rate at which we're both vibe coding new security disasters and then expect them autonomously, not make mistakes.
Actually, I was going to go to NemoClaw
Mm.
as my next suggested topic, and the NVIDIA conference, which just passed. Um,
Mhm.
what is NemoClaw? I mean, I'm not a guru in this area,
Oh, so
so
Nemo is NVIDIA's prefix for "we want to make money." I think it's from the ancient Jensen's. But just like CUDA, I think was probably the cognate. If we realized that CUDA was a moneymaker. But Nemotron, Nemo, so on. So Nemo Claw is attempting to brand that by saying, "Oh, we have better enterprise security." Well, it turned out it's just kind of a Docker jail around what would be Claw, and it fell rather rapidly. And there's a bunch of skeptical links. We can throw you a few in there, but just because they didn't handle a radical reincarnation and reinvention of personal agent security from the launch date at their big keynote doesn't mean I count them out. In fact, at this point, you probably have the fact that most venture capitalists have, a bunch of people dialing them all the time with their, "I've got my new so-and-so Claw startup." Sandboxing, seat belting, Claw containers. We've seen Iron Claw and Carapace using Cedar from our friend Sarah Chetty. We're seeing two or three other startups that have been talking about using Cedar to control Claw. I've now seen two other companies that are talking about creating new programming languages that Claw agents can be written in a language that can be verifiably trusted. Where that comes, we'll see. This is definitely a moment, and I think that it's a moment, as they say in the old cliche about the Chinese character for opportunity and risk, that, this crisis that we have with OpenClaw both shows this huge potential consumer interest in wanting agents that actually get shit done for them privately. There's a huge latent demand for it. It's not clear that the product does those things and with those priorities. And I don't know that we have a lot on our cupboard shelves from the computer science archives of the last 40 years to say the usual answer would be, here's this 20-year-old idea and it's pretty well validated. Let's just go start around that. So let's talk about that. I mean, where does the future go here?
You mentioned Sarah Cacchetti, and she gave a talk at the conference, which is listed on the wiki, about threat modeling authorization in
Mhm.
MCP. And of course, so she scheduled a dinner, or I should say, her agent, Claudry Hepburn, scheduled a dinner after the summit, and um, and so it's interesting because at Janssen Project we were researching perhaps also. So Sarah uses the Cedarling as the authorization engine, or as the PDP to run the Cedar engine in her agent, I should say. She's using the WASM Cedarling version. And we look to do something similar at Janssen Project. And our developers' conclusion was that OpenClaw is not architected with security by design. So trying to actually backwards, um, integrate security is just going to not be a good idea. And a lot of its basic assumptions about impersonating you and connecting to existing websites is just unsound.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's why you buy a lobster in the fish tank at the supermarket. You put rubber bands on its claws. Sure, it's safe, but now it can't do anything.
Yeah.
I will,
Or
I will quote from Sarah's talk here just a second to anchor our conversation, that the MCP threat models that she's talking about, OpenID Foundation paying attention to for OAuth, would be MCP attacks that enable attackers to exfiltrate sensitive data, compromise password protected accounts, and gain remote control of local machines. Of course, what's even more terrifying is that in the last 48 hours, we've been doing the fact that Anthropic's latest bid for hype and attention has been threatening people with a model that is so powerful that perhaps even mythical, that mythos cannot be trusted with you ordinary companies. We will go create a cabal called Glasswing and give them some money and time to use this, but that these attacks, the threat model that she's describing, are now within reach of a motivated, well-expended budget AI attacker. And now we have a very lopsided playing field where we have AI playing offense, finding all flaws, things that are 0 days that have been out for decades, and you can go read the Red Team report from Anthropic to be terrified properly. But we don't have fundamentally secure building blocks to try and combat this. And so, you don't want it in a dogfight where you're just constantly, trying to react to CVEs being filed by AI faster and faster, even if they are all on the up and up players and they aren't any states that are trying to really screw with you. If we want to kind of establish dominance in this war of offense and defense, we need a new kind of weapon. perhaps a tool from a more elegant age, like the lightsaber or the parenthesis in Lisp.
Actually, I'll pivot back to MCP Dev Summit for a minute and say that the one answer everyone at the conference seemed to have was to have some type of MCP proxy that enforces security. Even IBM, the last talk I attended of the summit was basically about their MCP proxy and about how they can use it to enforce zero trust or enforce policies.
It,
But
it's the opposite of the old Feynman quote about the little old lady who says, "You can't fool me, Sonny. It's universe on the back of a turtle." And it's like, what's the turtle telling us? Turtles all the way down. All of these solutions that have the LLM as judge, none of them convince me, but that's me, old man in a hat, being annoyed here. But the number one winner in the top 10 startups that got to compete at the RSA conference Sandbox for the $5 million prize was Jordy AI, another attempt at, and I wish them a very promising attempt at using AI to judge whether something is about to be exfiltrated as personally significant or not. And different companies like Capsule Security talking about using small language models to detect quickly and on the fly that it's beginning to think a prohibited thought. Or even Realm Labs, which is kind of doing pre-crime and bot crime and saying, hey, you're beginning to see the neurons activate to think about a credit card number. Turn it off, right? These companies and so on all speak to a wish for doing this with just, if I could just use LLMs to judge other LLMs, but they all suffer, from the same essentially problems about prompt injection and hallucination attacks. There's not the clean separation between code and data you'd expect there to be. I still think we need a fundamentally different technique and approach to look at this. But before I go off into my ravings, I'm just going back to observing and reporting the news that LLMs all the way down helps, but it's still a who will watch the watchman type of problem.
Yeah.
A flawed cop is not great against another flawed cop.
As the Wall Street Journal article about the vending machine indicated or found out when they introduced the CEO bot, one bot governing another bot it just doesn't work.
Mhm.
But actually, I wanted to bring back to your point about you said something like, and I started talking about MCP proxies. Everybody got one, but the authorization models in them are all different.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, we live in a kind of great ferment.
was that in order for us to get governance, we need to provide developers with a better pattern, or we need to say what good looks like. And right now, my impression is that we are saying governance is important, but we're not giving developers sort of the templates and strategies to tell them how they can build software that properly plugs into the governance enterprise and enables us to see the risk and make sure that people are accountable and makes it transparent.
I would echo you in the modern hipster parlance of AI startups everywhere. Where's the evals? What's the benchmark? I would argue that we don't yet have a figure on what is a challenge benchmark for computer systems to be well governed. A governance benchmark is not, can I generate a SOC 2 report for an organization for instead of $10,000, $5,000?
Clearly, with the Delves of the world out there, that's true.
But it's also not clear that you want a governance benchmark that says $ import U.S. federal code of regulations, right? It's not like everything that could be governed should be in this thing either. But it leads to an interesting question. Where do we invest? Where do we begin to invest in moving this field forward? And if, as a think tank, and again, supposedly we're in a world of a lot of AI safety think tanks and government think tanks, maybe I'm unaware of it, but I'm kind of the interested amateur reader that I would like to think I would be hearing noises about. Not an OAuth security benchmark says how often does it break out of the jail or steal a credential, but a genuine GovOps benchmark set that says, here's the challenge proposition. And if we only score 10% here, let's give ourselves a goal as an industry in the next 2 years to get that to 90%.
Yeah, we need probably a number of metrics.
You were talking about Tiger at one point, right? The idea of like
Yes.
metrics about identity governance, about control governance, about network flow.
I couldn't remember what it was. I was just searching through my Telegram to see if I could find it. But yeah, it was a Tiger score. But within each of those, so Tiger would be looking at transparency, the identity layer, the governance layer, and the event layer. So looking at each of those, but if you break into every one of those, I think there'll be additional metrics. And I do think part of transparency, part of governance is being able to talk to governors. And we do need some simplifying metrics to communicate to governors, like the CEO and the board, how we're doing. And if we don't talk to the developers about how they would enable us to collect those metrics, then you get 50 MCP servers all defining governance differently, with no interoperability and no hope of ever getting.
Well, this is why I also argue that there's so much money flowing into what's being called MCP observability, because observability is governance in reverse. In the rearview mirror, you need to wish you had logs to find consequences and audit and punish who should have done or where did this even happen, right? Root cause analysis. So notice that I think I consider a lot of the very exciting innovation going on in MCP and AI observability generally as also, I think, in part falls under the umbrella of governance. So the question is, of course, we're going to invent ideas here on a podcast. It's that the people out there are the ones who are going to want to meet those people. And I was realizing as we come towards time here that I also want to go over not just the trip reports, but some upcoming events too. What are some thoughts about what you've seen recently and how you want to?
Well, actually, so you're correct. The pigeon should be flying, because this is a weird episode. It's more like a conversation than a interview.
Weird, wacky, and excellent. I guess we'll have to wait and see if we get some clips out of this and see what people tell us.
Yeah.
But I will say that I really want to meet the people. So if I had my closing bit, I would remind you that we had a great time in the last month or so. Mythos, I think, is a story you need to delve deeper into. The Delve story, I'm glad we got it up to some people. I want to hear what people's thoughts are about whether governance even has this split. That'd be my big summary, is that, hey, does this capital G, little g governance thing make sense? The idea that governance is like the next iteration of moving up market and up a level from being in the weeds of auth N and auth Z policy. Here's what our listeners think. But I know what would find people is the most important thing. I know that some things coming up is our AOth episode. We're having one on automated reasoning with Varun. But also online is the CSA's Agentic AI Security Summit coming out April 29th to 30th online. Zenity is having an AI Summit in May, on 27th May in San Francisco and June 17th in New York. And most importantly, the Internet Identity Workshop. IIW has just, I think, offered you and I a code to our listeners, IOH_XLII_20, 20% off of the 42nd IIW. You can look online in the comments for that. And the day after IW is Agentic Internet Workshop by our colleague and GovOps partner in crime, Andor Kesselman is one of the main drivers there, along with Kalia Hamlin. Kalia, Identity Woman. But that one's IOH AIW2_10. So those are coming up at the end of this month. So let's meet the people who are going to solve this, not...
I will put that in the episode notes, which is pretty obscure. So I hope
the LinkedIn comment underneath this one will include it too. So deep link to Eventbrite.
I won't say IIW discount code : so it won't be Googleable, but any listeners will be able to find it. Yeah, please. I'll be attending both.
I will too.
My ticket for both. And IIW always has a lot of agentic. Or not always, but in the last couple, has certainly had a lot of agentic identity and authorization discussion. So I think it'll be a big topic this year.
You don't make it to 22 years of annual meetings without staying somewhat relevant to the trends of the day in our technology business.
I first heard the letters MCP at IAW. So
I remember them from Tron, but I'm old. Also, one more last plug was May 21st. I don't know if anyone else might be interested in joining up at the OpenSSF Community Day in Minneapolis, the Open Source Security Foundation. So let's see if that comes around. But right now for April, let's see where our PI is and who else cares about these problems. If you do, please throw other ideas in the comments about where to meet up.
Yes, and I'll just quickly announce, I got tired of the pigeons flying. So I'll just do a quick announcement. The next episode, we actually have a guest who is not an identity person. He's really a cybersecurity expert. His name is Sean Jurovieski. He's a security expert in incident response, policy development, and SIM management. A SIM would be like Splunk, for example. So it should be he's a pretty well-known speaker, sort of in the security track. and the security track and identity track don't always intersect. But I've been reading his work, and I think he's going to be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that next Tuesday. And yeah, with that, get your IIW tickets now before they sell out. Ditto for Agentic Identity Workshop. And with that, I don't know. I think that's it, Rohit. Should we call it here?
Absolutely. No, I say, just remember, we keep people reminded about the podcast, but the next one by number is going to be 187. I am looking forward to working with you on that one on verified and automated reasoning with Varun Pant from Amazon Web Services. So let you figure out which order they're going to come up in, but look to you soon.
That one's on April 21st.
Great.
And right, it is the numerically right after this one, but it's actually the week after next. It's 2 weeks. A week from next Tuesday.
So in sequential order, I will see you next, but I'm looking forward to listening to the human gap in your identity program next too.
Right. And Rohit, you're actually on next Thursday with Dick Hart, and we're going to talk about AAuth.
AAuth. If there's one person I expect to do Canadian style auth, it would be Dick Hart. AAuth.
It's getting adoption, or it's getting interest. Yeah. And so I see a lot of Christian post a blog.
Solo AI. Solo.io.
So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Okay. Well, with that, Rohit, thank you so much for jumping on today. This was, one of the more fun episodes for me.
Thank you. And I hope I hear from our audience too, whether this is a format I'd like to see again. It's really tough to not get into jargon, but it's also pretty intimate.
And yeah, we'll see you next Tuesday.